Welcome to the SAFeTY Chronicles, exploring how to keep people and pets safe from the cycle of interpersonal violence. I am your host, Allie Phillips, founder and CEO of Sheltering Animals and Families Together, the SAFeTY Program, a nonprofit organization working with domestic violence shelters to eliminate the pet housing barrier to safety. As the founder, I have led the global movement in helping domestic violence shelters create on-site pet housing while elevating the criminal justice response to how animal abuse links to crimes against people. I am a former prosecuting attorney, internationally recognized legal expert and public speaker, award-winning author, and advocate for protecting vulnerable victims. In this podcast, we will explore how and why animals are harmed in the cycle of family violence and the human-animal bond that keeps victims in harm's way with their pets. Guest speakers and I will share strategies for shelters and professionals working to safeguard survivors, why pet-inclusive sheltering is life-saving, and safety tips for those who need help. None of the content will be graphic. If you are in harm's way, please contact your nearest domestic violence shelter or call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. Let's get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the podcast. I have my cup of joe in my cat coffee cup. I have two cats here in my home office. And let's tackle this next topic because it's a big topic. It's a complicated topic, but I feel it's a very important topic, no matter who you are or where you work. But of course, this is for anybody who works for a domestic violence shelter or anybody who may be seeking the services of a domestic violence shelter. So I want to talk about the different status of animals that may be asked to come into a domestic violence shelter. So it's a complicated topic because the laws are different and it can be confusing. So what I want to talk about are service animals, assistance animals, emotional support animals, and therapy animals, which are all different than a pet, all different than a companion animal. Okay, so let me go through and define what they are to really help you understand, because if you work for a shelter, you need to know this. You really do, because you don't want to get into any legal or financial problems with this. So let's start with service animals. So any dog that is individually trained to do work or perform a task for the benefit of an individual with a disability is going to be a service animal, okay? So they work with one person, one individual, not a group of people, and they are trained in a task. And that task can benefit something like a physical disability, a sensory disability, psychiatric disability, intellectual or other mental disability. Now, service animals do not have what's called a crime deterrent effect by simply being in the presence of a person, and they are not emotional support. Service animals are not there for your well-being, your comfort, or your companionship. They are there to work. They are there to perform a task. The best example is a leader dog for the blind. Okay, so this is really important to understand because service animals in the United States are protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So the ADA requires that service or guide dogs be allowed entry into public buildings and public access areas. Period. They are allowed entry. Okay, this is a federal right. Now, this includes domestic violence shelters with some very limited exceptions for shelters that are owned and operated by religious organizations. But this is federal law. So under the ADA, a service animal is not a pet. They are not a companion animal. Their purpose is not to provide therapy or comfort or support. They perform a task like helping someone walk, helping someone cross a street safely, helping someone detect seizures, to open doors, to pick up medication. Okay? Shelters must take service animals under the ADA. Now, if you work at a shelter and if you have never had a request of someone wanting to bring in a service animal, now is the time to know how you're going to handle that, because you have to. And this is where the SAFeTY program can help you. So with service animals, a shelter, and I'm just going to talk about domestic violence shelters. I'm not going to get into all the other public access and public buildings. I'm just going to talk about domestic violence shelters. So with the service animal, a shelter can ask what the disability is and what task the dog performs. That's it. A shelter cannot ask for documentation. A shelter cannot deny entry to the service or the guide dog because of allergies or fear of animals, or we don't have space, we're not ready. A shelter cannot charge pet fees like a pet deposit or extra fees. It can charge for any damage. Okay. And service animals are the one category that is protected under federal law. So you want to make sure that you are following the law. Otherwise, there can be legal and financial ramifications for your shelter. These are the animals that wear a vest that says, service animal, do not pet. Okay, these are the animals that you do not come up to and pet them. They are working. They are not a companion animal. They are not a pet. They only work with one person. They are highly trained and highly skilled. Now, here's the thing. People can buy service animal vests on the internet and try to masquerade their companion animal as a service animal. If you are suspicious that an animal truly provides a service, you are limited to the 2 questions. Okay, you are limited to the 2 questions that I talked about, which is, what is the disability and what is the task that the dog performs? Now, unfortunately, I have seen service animals working in a therapeutic setting. I have done a lot of training through a program I created called Therapy Animal Supporting Kids, where I have helped, and I wrote the guidebook for child advocacy centers, family justice centers, and for all criminal justice agencies to allow therapy animals in to help child victims and even adult victims of crime. And I have unfortunately seen service animals working in a therapeutic setting, and that is a misuse of the service animal label. And if that animal truly has gone through the process to become a service animal, they could lose that label. Okay, so just be very, very careful. I know there are domestic violence shelters that bring in animals to help survivors. Make sure the label is proper. All right, so that's service animal in a nutshell. Let's talk about assistance animals, okay? This one can get a little confusing. So assistance animals are defined under the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, okay? Now, an assistance animal is an animal that works, provides assistance, or performs a task for the benefit of a person with a disability. Or, okay, or that provides emotional support that alleviates one or more identified effects of a person's disability. So this may seem a little confusing because, again, we're dealing with a disability. An assistance animal is not a pet. What it is it's kind of a hybrid definition of either being a service animal or an emotional support animal, which I'm going to talk about next, but it's because of a disability. But an assistance animal is not protected under the ADA and not allowed entry into all public buildings and all public access spaces. So the label assistance animal primarily relates to public housing because it is defined under HUD for public housing. So if you have an assistance animal, you can request a domestic violence shelter to keep your assistance animal with you as a reasonable accommodation. But you must abide by pet restrictions of the property owner. Okay, so this is the difference between the ADA and HUD definitions. So when you're dealing with public housing and you don't have a traditional service animal, but you have an assistance animal, you have to abide by the pet restrictions of the property owner, because some domestic violence shelters rent property. They're renting apartment units, they're renting housing, especially in transitional housing. They're not in maybe a traditional shelter setting. So they have to work with the property owner's pet restrictions. Now, under the Fair Housing Act, housing providers cannot refuse to make reasonable accommodations in rules, in policies, in practices, or in services when such accommodations may be necessary to afford a person with a disability the equal opportunity to use and enjoy the dwelling. Okay, that's a lot of legal mumbo jumbo. What this means is when somebody is getting into public housing or is going into a shelter situation that is public housing under the Fair Housing Act, the housing provider cannot refuse to make the accommodations for the assistance animal when you have a disability. They have to give you a reasonable accommodation and the equal opportunity for that housing. So this law and assistance animals is specifically addressed in public housing and assisted housing programs where assistance animals or the emotional support animals that serve a disability cannot be denied entrance. They have to make a reasonable accommodation. It doesn't mean all accommodations, and I'm going to go through that in a minute. So a housing owner under HUD and the Fair Housing Act, to determine if an animal serves a disability, the owner, the housing owner, the shelter can ask two questions. And the person may need to provide reliable disability-related information. That's different than the ADA, okay? So the two questions that can be asked are, does the person have a disability, physical or mental impairment, that substantially limits one or more major life activities? And does the person have a need for the assistance animal? So you notice the difference. They're not asking what task the animal provides, because the task is service animal related, whereas assistance animal related is different. They ask different questions, and they may ask for disability related information. So a letter from a doctor, for example. Now, the housing owner, which can include a shelter, they can deny the request if the housing provider demonstrates that this assistance animal will impose undue financial and administrative burden, or would fundamentally alter the essential nature of the housing, or the specific animal in question would pose a direct threat to health and safety of others, or would result in significant physical damage to the property. Okay? This type of language leaves room open for abuses on both sides. So it can leave open the room for abuse by the person requesting accommodation, where they could just label their pet as an assistance animal, providing emotional support, when in fact it's not true. Now, don't get me wrong. I love my cats. They provide me emotional support, but they are not emotional support pets, okay? Because I don't meet the definition. I just love them and they love me. Now, the abuse can also happen by the housing provider, where they could slip through one of those four loopholes that I just described to deny an accommodation. So they could say, oh, this is going to be an undue financial burden because we're going to have to change some things, or it's just going to alter the nature of our housing, or if you have a dog, if it's a big dog, oh, it's going to result in significant physical damage. So again, and I'm going to talk at the end of this podcast about where you can go for help if you feel like these laws have been violated. But the definition of an assistance animal under HUD has loopholes in it. Okay, so it leaves open room for abuses on both sides. Let's talk about the third category of animals, emotional support animals. These are defined under the Fair Housing Act, under HUD, as any animal that provides emotional support alleviating one or more symptoms or effects of a person's disability. Emotional support animals provide companionship, relieve loneliness, and sometimes help with depression, anxiety, and certain phobias, but do not have special training to perform tasks that assist people with disability. The tasks that are performed, those are the service animals, okay? Emotional support animals don't serve a task. They're not opening doors and getting you across the street. They are providing comfort and emotional support. And emotional support animals are not limited to dogs. You could have an emotional support iguana. Okay. Now, some people obtain a doctor's note so that their pet can be labeled an emotional support animal. There are people doing this so that they can get into rental housing, into public housing, and they just don't want to be separated from their pets. And I totally get it. And if your doctor does that for you, then you can have them recognized as an emotional support animal. Now, legally, as an attorney, a doctor's letter does not turn your pet into a service or assistance animal, but it can label them as an emotional support animal. But again, the housing provider could go into one of those four loopholes and say, you know what, this animal is going to pose a direct threat to health and safety of others. It's going to create physical damage. It's going to provide an undue financial or administrative burden. It's going to fundamentally alter the essential nature of our housing. Like they can fall into a loophole. And I get a lot of emails like this from people asking for help. Well, unfortunately, this is where the loopholes are. Now, emotional support animals do not have a right to enter public buildings or public access areas, but they can enter by invitation. So if you need to go to court, or if you want to go, into a restaurant, you have to get permission. You just cannot take your emotional support animal in and think that they have the rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act that the service animals have. Service animals can go into any public space, period. Assistance animals, no. Emotional support animals, no. Unless the public building is public housing, and then the Fair Housing Act applies, okay? So you just have to get permission for the animals to come in. Now, intermixed in all of this, if I haven't lost you at this point, VAWA, the Violence Against Women's Act, which is a federal law. VAWA provides housing protections for survivors of domestic violence under the HUD Fair Housing Act. And that can include rental housing, such as rental housing under transitional housing programs. So, we've got a mix of federal laws coming in to work together. So VAWA in particular provides housing protections for survivors. So just know that if you are seeking housing as a domestic violence survivor. All right. Next, I want to talk about therapy animals. Therapy animals are not legally defined under federal law, but they provide therapeutic support to people. They are usually a personal pet that go through specific training where the handler, the pet owner, actually gets trained. You're not training the cat or the dog or the rabbit. They are naturally therapeutic. What is happening is the handler is getting trained to take their personal pet into a setting like a child advocacy center, going into court to help people testify, going into schools and libraries and assisted living facilities and hospice centers, and you name it. And these therapy animals are credentialed by an organization, and they work with a handler to provide service to numerous people. So where service animals and assistance animals work with one person, therapy animals work with a lot of people. Okay, so these are the animals that wear a vest that says therapy animal, I love hugs. Like, you can go up, you can pet them, you can hug them. They work with a lot of people. Now, these animals are not allowed by law in public locations, public buildings, or public access areas, but they are allowed by invitation. So a therapy animal can be invited into a school, into a courthouse, into a prosecutor's office, into a domestic violence shelter by invitation, but it's not by law. And they work with a variety of people, unlike the animals that I've already discussed. Now, in addition to these 4 primary labels, I'm seeing a lot of other labels come into the industry that really don't have definition, like comfort animal, facility dog. These are not legally defined, but again, they are allowed into a public setting by invitation, not by right. So, with domestic violence shelters being obligated to accept service and potentially assistance animals pursuant to the ADA and the Fair Housing Act, if you work or volunteer at a shelter, your shelter should already have a housing system in place for these animals, because with service animals, you cannot deny entry. When it comes to sheltering animals and families together, where we help domestic violence shelters welcome pets, welcome companion animals, this is a good starting point, knowing that you have to accept service animals. If you have to accept that leader dog for the blind, you can also accept Fluffy, the dog. And this is where we will help you, to help you understand and transition, because the housing is pretty much going to be the same, and it will actually be even more expanded for companion animals, because the service animal must be housed directly with the person they are servicing. Whereas a companion animal, you can go through any of the SAFeTY housing models, and you can create an indoor kennel, an outdoor kennel. So you actually have more flexibility with companion animals than you do service animals. It's easier to house a companion animal than it is a service animal. And this is what I like to help domestic violence shelters understand. So if you are a domestic violence shelter, please consult with your shelter's attorney or a local attorney to also know your state and local laws. If you are a survivor seeking a domestic violence shelter, and if you believe that you were discriminated against due to having an animal, maybe an animal that is a service animal, or an assistance animal, or an emotional support animal, or a companion animal, please contact an attorney. Please speak to your local legal aid agency. If you don't have a legal aid in your community, but you have a nearby law school, most law schools have a legal aid department. They have facilities where the law students can provide you legal advice, so you can go there. Or contact your state domestic violence coalition for guidance. And you can just Google that and find your state coalition. This is an important topic, and it's important for all domestic violence shelters to fully understand these federal laws regarding animals, as well as your state and local laws, because ADA covered service animals have an absolute right to enter your shelter. Are you prepared for that? If you are prepared for a service animal, then you are also prepared for any other kind of companion animal and pet to come into your shelter. And this is where the SAFeTY program can help you understand how simple it is to be available and open to all animals, regardless of the label. So please reach out. We are a free service to domestic violence shelters. I will help you. This is what I love to do. So I hope this was beneficial. And if you have any questions about this, I'm not really able to give you legal advice, even though I am a licensed attorney. I'm not able to get into an attorney-client relationship with you. So that's why I give you some suggestions of where to go if you have questions or if you need help. But if you are a domestic violence shelter, I'm here to help you. Thanks for tuning in. I hope this was helpful. I would love for you to like this podcast, comment, share it, and subscribe to this podcast. So thanks again, and we'll chat next time. If you are in harm's way and need help, please visit the Pet Inclusive Shelter listing at safetyprogram.org, call your nearest domestic violence shelter, or call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. Want to support our efforts and help us keep the SAFeTY Startup Manual free for domestic violence shelters? Consider donating at safetyprogram.org/donate. Your donation saves lives.